Good evening, everybody. It's my true pleasure to welcome everybody back to a 28th season of our Sea Secrets series. Our 2023 series will have 6 lectures. I'm Rani Avissar, the Dean of the School, and we have a fantastic lecture this evening that will be held by Professor Hanselmann. Before we do that, however, it is customary for us to welcome one of our alumni and have them speak for a few minutes and show you what they are about to do and what they are doing. So this evening, I am also delighted to welcome Geneva Wright. And Geneva is an alumni of our programs. And in fact, she is soon going to be a double alumni because she is also doing a Ph.D. At the University of Miami in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy, jointly with the Abbess Center. And Geneva is presently the archaeologist for the National Park Service. And she is stationed in Fort Collins, Colorado, to support the impact of the climate change and sea level rise. I didn't know that Colorado worries about sea level rise, but you know, who knows, right? At the pace that we are going, it might reach that place as well. Geneva began her duties with the Park Service in January 3rd, 2022, so about a year ago. Prior to this, Geneva supported the Partnerships and Innovations Directorate of the Department of Defense POWMIA, accounting agency, by serving to lead archaeologists for underwater partner development and field projects. And before that, she served as an archaeologist with the NPS Submerged Research Center. Research on climate change impact to archaeological resource began when she was an interim in the Biscayne National Park as a graduate student. So Geneva is currently an executive board member of the Advisory Council for Underwater Archaeology and the chair of the Climate Change and Submerged Cultural Heritage Working Group. Before I welcome Geneva, I want also to thank our sponsor for this series, for this lecture series, which is obviously extremely important for us. Without that support, we could not, in fact, maintain this activity. So in particular, I'd like to thank again the Shepard Broad Foundation, Bill Galway, which I have seen in the audience, is right here, Cheryl Gold, the KB Life Enhancement Forum, the Key Biscayne Community Foundation, John Micron Family Foundation, Gail Nansen in honor of Russell F. Nansen, Nicole and Myron Wang, who are also sitting with us this evening, and Southern Glazers Wine and Spirit. Geneva, all yours.
Good evening. Thank you for the kind introduction. Several years ago, I was introduced to my current research through the privilege of meeting U.S. Navy Seaman Don Stratton. At 7:30 in the morning on December 7th, 1941, Don might have been thinking about the upcoming baseball championship scheduled for the ship that afternoon, or perhaps some holiday shopping on his next liberty. Only an hour later, his life had changed forever. His ship had exploded beneath him. He was covered in terrible burns over 3/5 of his body, and he was one of a few survivors of the destruction of the battleship USS Arizona. 1,177 of his crewmates perished. Today, the USS Arizona is a somber war grave and memorial. It's an iconic cultural symbol, and it's also one of thousands of shipwrecks that still contain large amounts of marine pollutants. In addition to serving as the final resting place of nearly 1,000 sailors and Marines, this scene of terrible tragedy and sacrifice also still contains an estimated 500,000 gallons of fuel oil inside a deteriorating hull. Driven by the fame of the shipwreck as well as the potential of a major oil release, in the 1980s, the National Park Service established the USS Arizona Preservation Project, a multidisciplinary research effort that over the course of 2 decades, produced a tremendous amount of information, including a site-specific corrosion model. With all of this data available, this artifact of the deadliest conflict in human history might also pose some answers for another global crisis, climate change. You see, the current corrosion model does not incorporate critical environmental variables, which is a challenge in an age of rising temperatures, increasing storms, and ocean acidification. Moreover, archaeologists around the world, we're all struggling with how to quantify and assess climate impacts to submerged sites. My research here at the University of Miami is centered on trying to understand the climate impacts to the USS Arizona, and thereby expand into understanding of these impacts to submerged sites around the world. My first research question centers on taking all of the available information and modeling and creating a vulnerability assessment model. What I mean by this is taking downscaled climate projections and exposures such as temperature, water depth, changes to chemistry, forecasts for increasing storm frequencies and intensities, as well as water depth, and integrate those with the sensitivity of the cultural material itself based on the corrosion model for Arizona's low-carbon steel hull. With consistent vulnerability assessment modeling in place, the next question is, of course, what do we do with that information? I've been working on a collaborative framework that seeks to explore and develop a range of adaptation actions for cultural heritage, not just underwater, but all types of cultural heritage worldwide. And I'm trying to use the work at the USS Arizona to pilot this and provide the shipwrecks managers with a range of options and actions that they can assess. Finally, I want to see how this can transfer out to shipwrecks around the world, underwater cultural heritage around the world, and most particularly, other potentially polluting shipwreck sites. As illustrated by this somewhat dire graphic in the bottom left, there's approximately 8,500 identified potentially polluting shipwrecks around the world, none of which have as much information available as the USS Arizona does. My hope is to provide archaeologists and cultural heritage managers with tools to better understand climate impacts, respond to them, and in the case of potentially polluting shipwrecks, to also protect the surrounding marine environments. When Don Stratton passed away in 2020, his family shared that one of his final wishes was that the USS Arizona would be remembered. My hope is that this is not only a site of memorialization, but also a place where we can advance human knowledge in our work in the climate crisis. I want to express my profound gratitude to Don's memory, as well as my thanks to the U.S. Navy and its service members, the National Park Service Submerged Resources Center, and Pearl Harbor National Memorial, and of course, to the University of Miami for supporting this research and my presence here this evening. And of course, many thanks to all of you.
Thanks, Geneva. That's very impressive, and we are so proud of your achievements and what is going to happen with your career. By the way, since we have an attentive audience, for us to be able to bring talented students like Geneva, we need to provide more fellowship for students that are deserving it. And anybody that is willing to contribute to the scholarships fund for our students is more than welcome to speak with Jennifer and meet with her and correspond with her. And I believe that her email is written in the back. The presentation this evening by Dr. Frederick Hanselmann, that goes by Fritz, okay, is another great activity that we are going to have, and a fascinating topic. Dr. Hanselmann has been an archaeologist for more than 20 years, and I'm going to read, okay, all his achievements, because there is no way I can remember them by heart. I just know Dr. Fritz is a great contributor to our school, a great colleague, never, ever says no to any request that we have from him. So that's easier for me to remember him or to know him this way. But having said that, he has directed numerous projects in Latin America, the Caribbean, and North America. He's a technical cave and closed-circuit rebreather diver, a certified scuba instructor, a Nautical Archaeology Society tutor, and a fellow of the Explorers Club. He has been featured widely in the press and media, including documentaries and programs on the National Geographic Channel, the Sundance Channel, the Travel Channel, and the South by Southwest Film Festival. He's also author of a couple of books and a contributing authors to others. Fritz, welcome to Sea Secrets.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Dean Avasar. Thank you, Geneva. And thank you all for being here this evening. I always like to tell people that I try to surround myself with folks that are smarter than myself. And Geneva's a wonderful student and is doing some phenomenal research. So tonight we're going to talk about some sea stories, some piracy on the open seas, and think about what archaeology, what archaeology can do, not just from look at how cool these artifacts are point of view, but also what can it tell us about ourselves and human activity over the ages. Archaeology makes history tangible. We actually can interact physically with the past, and it provides a completely different portal through which we can understand how we came, how we came to be where we are. So for thousands of years, humankind has applied the waters of our oceans, seas, lakes, and rivers. And that oceanic highway, or the aquatic highways, if you will, have not always been the kindest. And so over those thousands of years of human interaction and maritime activity, we have an actual physical record of what was going on. From dugout canoes, ancient dugout canoes, to Roman shipwrecks, to modern steam vessels, and as Geneva mentioned, modern conflict. This is all represented globally through the underwater archaeological record. And during those thousands of years, one of the most romanticized aspects of this maritime activity is that of piracy. Right? People have been fascinated with pirates for a long time. And that's one of the questions we get at as archaeologists is what really was going on? What do we know about these different activities that took place throughout time? And so tonight we'll chat a little bit about pirates. And then we have other things that we can talk about later. But from the early 20th century black and white swashbuckling movies, which many of you may remember. I grew up watching Seahawk and Tyrone Power and Errol Flynn, to the well-known tourism rides that are here in our lovely state, to the love it or hate it, ubiquitous characterization of pirates in popular media. People have been fascinated with this, but what do we really know about them and what drove piracy? And so tonight we're going to specifically talk about two projects and the ships that were lost by Captain Henry Morgan and Captain Kidd in the 17th century. But what led to the advent of piracy in the Caribbean, right? We can look at Spanish conquest and colonization. If you think about when Columbus first, quote unquote, discovered the Americas, from 1492 until about 1541, Spain went about colonizing vast swaths of the Western Hemisphere. So from San Francisco in the Northwest all the way down to Buenos Aires and Santiago in South America, they controlled a vast geographical area, right? And we know that what they were looking for was actually natural resources and precious metals. Even Sir Walter Raleigh, in admiration of Spanish achievement, which we can use quotes for that as well, said that they had overcome tempests, shipwrecks, famine, overthrows, mutinies, heat and cold, pestilence, and all manner of diseases, both old and new, together with extreme poverty and want of all things needful. But what they were really doing was extracting resources so they could fund the various conflicts that they were having back in Europe. And so we know that there's gold and silver, and there are mines throughout Mexico and South America, and they were using the treasure fleets to transport the gold and silver back to Spain. Well, one of the linchpins in this transportation of these resources, of these precious metals, is Panama. The Isthmus of Panama became crucial in connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean and transporting the gold and silver from the mines in South America, in modern-day Peru and Bolivia and elsewhere, to the Caribbean and then back to Spain. Well, it was these resources and these precious metals that really caught the curiosity of other countries. In 1582, Francis Drake began his circumnavigation of the world, and one of the things he did was sail up the Chagres River in Panama and sack Venta de Cruces on that expedition. Well, that made the Spanish scratch their heads and say, maybe we should think about fortifying our assets and fortifying our towns and villages and cities. So in the late 16th century, early 17th century, there was a massive effort and of construction to fortify the various important ports and cities in the Spanish Main. And one of the things to also think about is Francis Drake actually came back to Panama, and he died in 1596. He is legendarily buried in a lead coffin offshore of Portobello, Panama, where he was unable to actually sack that town. Fast forward almost 100 years later, and Henry Morgan comes onto the scene, and one of the things we can look at are economies of scale. So if you look at the red in the Western Hemisphere, that is what Spain controlled. But if you look at the little brown, you can see the inset down there to the left. That's the actual size of Spain. So Spain, after 100 years of conquest and colonization, was starting to have financial issues, being able to afford to maintain their colonies. Even in the 1580s, when Francis Drake was active, King Philip II had an annual salary of 6 million pesos, but his debts totaled 74 million. So you can imagine being a soldier or a colonist and not getting your paycheck and having to pick up a second job or two, or fend for your own sustenance, right? So this is sort of the stage that's set when Henry Morgan comes into the picture. And one of the things that I think is fascinating about historical and maritime archaeology is we can consider it text-aided. We have historical documents that we can use, so we can compare and contrast the historical record with what we're seeing in the physical remains in the archaeological record. All right, so it begs the question, did Henry Morgan look like this strapping guy who hits the gym, who may grace an iconic bottle of rum? Or was he more like this gentleman, little portly, he's got a double chin, doesn't hit the gym as much as the previous guy, previous slide. And so that's one of the things that is fascinating about this, is we actually get at what is the truth, right? What's fact and what's fiction. So Morgan is an interesting character. With Francis Drake, Queen Elizabeth instituted what she called her Western design, and that was to have England try to take control over Spanish resources in the Spanish colonies. Fast forward 60, 70 years, and Oliver Cromwell at the time, in the 1650s, was the Lord Protector of England. And he decided to return to the Elizabethan Western design. And in 1655, he sent a fleet of ships with a few thousand soldiers. They were severely routed at Santo Domingo, but they didn't want to return home without some kind of prize or some kind of reward. So they settled on Jamaica. They captured Jamaica, they wrested it from Spanish control, and at the time it was largely agricultural, and not much was going on there. A 19-year-old Henry Morgan was part of this original crew. So Henry Morgan cuts his teeth with these privateers. And we can talk about the difference between a privateer and a pirate. A privateer has an actual commission from a government and is their activity is sanctioned. But there's two sides to that coin, because if you're enacting violence against another state, they probably don't see that as being sanctioned. So one person's privateer is another person's pirate. So I like to think about Morgan as it's almost his first expedition as a captain for those of you that are familiar with it, I like to kind of compare it to a 18th or 17th century Grand Theft Auto, right? So he's cut his teeth. They finally give him his first fleet of 3 ships, and he's tasked with going out and acquiring wealth for himself and his crew, and that's how they would get paid in exchange for protecting Jamaica and protecting Port Royal. So Morgan says, you know what, we're not going to sack a coastal city, we're going to go into the interior. Sails into the Gulf of Mexico, sacks Villahermosa in the Bay of Campeche. When he returns, he finds that the Spanish have captured his ships, and then for the next 2 years, they navigate the coast up around the Yucatan, all the way down to Rio San Juan, which is the modern-day border between Nicaragua and Costa Rica, sail into Grenada, sack Grenada, and return back to Port Royal. So you can imagine people in Port Royal are kind of thinking, oh, you know, he was such a promising privateer, we don't know what happened to him, and then he shows up with a fleet of ships and a lot of wealth that he incurred over 2 years of pillaging and plundering the Caribbean coast from Mexico to Nicaragua. So from then on, the legend sort of built, and over the next 4 years, Morgan sacks Puerto Principe in Cuba. He sacks in Portobello in Panama, which Drake famously was unable to win. And he actually held the city ransom for a month until the governor of Panama paid 100,000 pieces of aid. He sacked Maracaibo and Gibraltar in modern-day Venezuela. And at this point, he's amassed a lot of wealth. He's become very famous. He's one of the most successful privateer in Port Royal, and he's been named an admiral. So he sets his sights on Panama City, and he knows that there are only 2 routes, but he also believes that Panama will not be as heavily defended because you have to cross the isthmus, cross the continental divide, the jungles, the mountains, etc., to get there. So the route in the red is the mule train that would take gold and silver from Panama City to Portobello and Nombre de Dios, which would then be picked up by the treasure fleets. The route in blue is a largely aquatic route that goes up the Chagres River and lands at Las Venta de las Cruces, and then you cross into the city. Well, Morgan knew that the main impediment or main obstacle would be the Castillo de San Lorenzo. So he sent 4 ships and almost 500 men to sack this fort. And what's interesting is he did it in this way because I should mention that based on all of his previous expeditions, he actually amassed what could potentially be the largest pirate fleet in the history of the Caribbean. He had 36 ships, 239 guns, or cannons, we call them guns when they're on a ship, and 1,846 men. But he didn't want to give away his force to the Spanish, so he sends an advance party. They have a pitched battle for 2 days. Morgan's men, typical to his luck, they win when an errant flaming arrow strikes the munitions stockpile and blows open a hole in the fort. And then he sails in 4 days later, and you can imagine his men are excited. They're on the cliff, they're looking down, only to their dismay to see that Morgan runs his flagship, the Satisfaction, aground on the reef right off of the fort and the cliff. Now, a ship back then is not like a car. You can't just slam on the brakes. And 4 other ships piled up, so we had to pile up on the reef. But typical to the kind of Grand Theft Auto scheme, he says, I don't care about these ships, let's keep pushing forward. They have a long, arduous trek across the isthmus where they have a pitched battle for a full day. They rout the Spanish cavalry, they enter Panama City, they sack it, and they hold it for a month, ransoming off hostages and doing things that are basically criminal and extremely unkind. The ruins of Panama City are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and he so shook the Spanish colonies with all of his activities and finally culminating in the sack of Panama City that they rebuilt elsewhere. So, trying to speed up a little bit, many years later, we decided to do a maritime landscape study of the Chagres River and the coast. So if you look here, This is where Castillo de San Lorenzo is. This is the Chagres River. This is actually the Panama Canal. So the Chagres River still is part of the lifeblood of maritime activity, even in modern day, because it feeds the Panama Canal. And one might ask, how can you lose so many ships in one small place? So if you look at a nautical chart, it's actually a little bit more treacherous and shallow than you might anticipate. So in 2008, with funding from the Wade Institute for Discovery, we set out to explore this and look at what was going on in this area. And we found indigenous artifacts, we found colonial Spanish artifacts, we found World War II, there's known California Gold Rush era shipwrecks in the area. But what was most interesting from looking at the perspective of piracy were these. And I know they don't look like it, but this is the magic happens in the conservation lab. These are actually guns, these are cannons. One of the things that spooked us most was the fact that we also did some precursory research online, and these are all artifacts that were for sale on various websites, such as a bronze breech block, a hand grenade that was being sold unconserved because the price of conservation was more than the actual value of the artifact. And then the most frustratingly is this pewter plate here. If you look here, you have maker's marks, and that's from Port Royal. But what happens with archaeology, and that's why we err so heavily on mapping and documentation and site visualization, is once an artifact is removed from the site, you can't put it back. So you lose the provenience, you lose the context, and you can't prove that that was part of that. So you lose that information and that connection of creating a relationship between the artifacts and the human activity that created the site. So based on that information, we decided to recover the guns and put them into a conservation lab. So we did that. That was fun with lift bags and getting them into Panama City. And then we returned for survey and test excavation. So this is a magnetometer, for those that do not know that, which is essentially like a large-scale metal detector, but it's much more sensitive. And what it does is it clues into the geographic region's magnetic signature and then picks up anomalies. And for us as archaeologists looking for shipwrecks, that means ferrous artifacts, cannons, anchors, even deck spikes. It can pick up really small artifacts as well. So if you look at this image, the green lines are what we boated, the red lines are what we had planned in the survey software, and then all the circles with the numbers are actually anomalies that we found through our initial survey. And then the fun part begins, diving all these different sites. So this might look like a rocky coral ledge, but upon further inspection, it turns out that we had a large section of wooden ship hull with cargo intact, including mule shoes, nails and spikes. And so we did what we could with the time and funding we had. We drew up a partial map, and then we returned with more funding in 2012 and 2014, where you can see here, we were able to actually open up the entire shipwreck. And what's interesting is we were finding things such as these lead cargo seals, sword blades, if you look closely. For those of you that are sword aficionados, I've screwed this up before, but this is actually the fuller. It's not a blood groove. It's to make the sword lighter, so it's easier to wield. We created a photo mosaic of the site, so you can see the bow and the stern. And we did all of this prior to sampling any of the artifacts. Here's the current status of the hand-drawn site map with hand measurements. So it's a combination of old and new school technology. And we recovered one of the chests, we took it to the lab, and we opened it up. And if you look very carefully, one of the things that's pretty interesting is if you see the round circle here, round here, there's a blade and a blade. There were scissors in this chest, and that's something that we start asking questions, right? So our hypothesis is, will this be, or a research question, could this ship belong to Henry Morgan? And I like to think of it, an analogy of, do you go to the store with your trunk empty, or do you go to the grocery store with your trunk full? So by looking into the historical record, we realized that this probably was not Morgan's wreck, and we were able to find in the archives in Spain that it's Nuestra Señora de Encarnación that sank in 1688. So it gives us further insight into colonial Spanish, but we didn't find Morgan's wreck. However, the guns revealed markings that they are English from the mid-17th century. So we found Morgan's guns. These are deck guns, and they would have fallen overboard when he ran aground. To finish up Morgan's story, interestingly enough, when he sacked Panama, It was at a time when England and Spain had just signed a peace treaty, but they'd allowed a 10-month grace period to let the colonies know. So his actions occurred during the grace period. So Spain was clamoring for retribution. England was laughing quiet behind closed doors. And they slapped him on the wrist, kept him in London for a while. Then they sent him back to Jamaica in 1675, so 4 years after he sacked Panama City. And then he dabbled in politics, retired in 1682 to his 400,000-acre sugar plantation, where he passed away in 1688 from complications with gout. So there's slight irony that there are some issues with alcohol, and this individual has a rum named after him. And to further compound that irony, Diagio and Captain Morgan Rum funded 2 of our field seasons of research. So, and this has been a focus of a number of different media presentations, and I'm going pretty fast through it, but there's still a lot to be done, and we're considering going back and having a field school and involving students, but we have around 150 anomalies based off of 2 surveys, and we've only ground truthed 27 of them. So the wrecks are still there. We just have to find the time and the money to go get them, right? Now, shifting gears a little bit, about the same time, right after Henry Morgan had passed away, Captain Kidd was becoming active. And what we're having now in the history of piracy is England had been relying on privateers to be its security. It's essentially its kind of private contractor army to defend Port Royal. But England was beginning to amass its navy and be able to get into the Caribbean more often. So there was a shift in who was controlling the violence, and there was a move away from piracy. Again, we can look at what's fact. Is this nefarious-looking character, is this Captain Kidd, as Howard Pyle depicted him in the early 1900s, or is it actually this gentleman here, who was a privateer in the late 1680s, assisted in the final days of the removing the Leislerian or Dutch rebellion against the colonial English government in New York, was aptly rewarded, married a wealthy widow, and had a house on Pearl Street in New York City. He dabbled in small-time privateering until 1695, but his status in society in New York, he rubbed elbows with a lot of influential and wealthy people, including a merchant named Robert Livingston. On a trip to London, they convinced the incoming governor of New York, or New England as well, that they should go after pirates, and they should capture the pirates, and then, it's sort of a failed business model if you think about the logic of it. Instead of returning the goods to the people that were robbed, we'll just keep it for ourselves. So Kidd, he fits out a boat called the Adventure Galley, which actually he designed it to have oars so you could row it in case they were in a naval engagement and there was no wind. So you can see Kidd's cruise starts in London. He acquires a crew in New England, in Boston, and New York, and sets sail going around the coast of Africa to come up in the Red Sea and try to capture pirates. Well, it took 2 years, and they had really nothing to show except for capturing some small vessels for provisions and supplies. So the crew gets mutinous after this time, and so much so that one accuses Kidd of causing them to be ruined, and in a fit of rage, he hits him over the head with a bucket, and the gunner, William Moore, dies the next day of his injuries. 2 months later, they get lucky. They make their main capture, the Quai de Merchant, in the Indian Ocean. It had French colors, or the French flag, and it had French ID passes. And Kidd figured that was enough to justify the capture. With all the cargo and everything on board, it's estimated about 150,000 to 200,000 pounds at that time in 1699. So Kidd's now been offshore from 1695 to 1699. But his crew gets upset, and they're tired of him being a heavy-handed captain. And this is where you also see a shift towards some of the more well-known kind of egalitarian actions of pirates and pirate crews, and the captain not having as much power. So when they hit St. Mary's Island off of Madagascar, the majority of his crew mutinies. They abandon him. They burn the Adventure Galley, and he's left with the Quai de Merchant. So with the skeleton crew, he crosses back over the Atlantic. He's a much better navigator than Henry Morgan. Henry Morgan just left his ships. where by the time he arrives in the Dutch Antilles, he realizes that he's been denounced as a pirate, so he's flabbergasted. He trades a little bit, and eventually he backs up to Hispaniola, where he decides he has to go home and clear his name. So he leaves the Quai de Merchant on the lee of the Catalina Island, which is off of now modern-day La Romana in the Dominican Republic, goes back to New England to try and clear his name. En route to doing that, he actually does something that is highly romanticized, but he's the only one that I know of that has done this in the actual historical record regarding piracy. He stops at Gardiner's Island, where a friend of his is a lighthouse keeper, and he buries some of the gold and silver and the jewels and the treasure from the Quai de Merchant. Once he gets to New England, Governor Bellamont, who had been one of his supporters, read the political tea leaves, arrests him, ships him off to London, where he's put in solitary confinement in Newgate Prison for almost 2 years. In May 1701, he stands trial, and he's found guilty of 3 counts of piracy and 1 count of murder with the bucket. So they hang him, but what happens is the first time he hangs, the rope breaks and he's still alive. Now, normally you would take that as a sign, and they let him go. And we'll get to why they didn't. They strung him up again, and the second time it took. But what's interesting is, and here we get into some of these bigger, broader social contexts of archaeological sites, because a shipwreck doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's connected to all these other social, the human activity. At the same time he's going to trial, one of the merchants who had a lot of the cargo on board that ship, actually filed suit in the court in England to try and recoup their losses from the theft of the goods. Well, the Admiralty office decided that, well, we need more information from you, so go back and acquire this information and this data. We need to really prove that this is yours. And by the time they did several trips to and from India, the statute of limitations had run out, and the British kept the spoils of the Quai de Merchant and actually used a chunk of it to build and construct Greenwich Hospital. So not necessarily a happy ending. But how do we look at these sites? Again, we sort of had a null hypothesis. We found the guns for Henry Morgan's wreck, but the shipwreck that we actually found turned out to be Spanish. So let's look at this. So Kidd testified that he left the ship in the lee of Catalina Island. Well, he left it under the charge of a merchant named Henry Bolton, who they dragged him back to court in London to explain this loss of the vessel. And he testified that he took it to the river, and then he got scared of the Spanish, so he set it on fire and fled the scene. Where this particular shipwreck is found is actually on the windward side of Catalina Island. And so that's one of the questions we have as we look at these sites, is what led the site to be where it is, or site formation process. You can see that the shipwreck, the site itself, is actually in shallow water quite close to the shore. And here you can see a site map. We also have some photogrammetric models, These are orthomosaics. If you look closely, you can see the cannons. There's one. But what's interesting is now we get to look at Kidd's testimony. If you look in the bottom right-hand corner, that's his signature. So we look at this, and he says there are guns that are in the hold. There are, which he took from the ship and from the Adventure Galley. He says that there's junk, scrap iron. So we have these ferrous artifacts. He said down here, if you look closely, it says it built at Surat by the Moors. All her seams are rabbited. So now we have some clues that we get to look at. All right, so we have cannons stacked like you would pack your shoes in a suitcase, as if they would be in the hold. They're not deployed. They're not aiming out anywhere, right? So spatially, this matches. Here's a 3D model of the one gun pile, if you can see that. And here's a different image of that. So here's the pile of guns, and you can see there are some other kind of disarticulated guns on that site. We recovered one cannon, and interestingly, to our surprise, we actually found some ship hull. Because of the benthic habitat there, it's all kind of coral and concretion and hardpan. We didn't expect to find any wooden ship hull. Well, we did. So we sent that off for analysis. Wood sample analysis came back teak. Now in the 17th century, teak was only indigenous to Thailand, Laos, Myanmar, and India. So that's another clue. So check that off the box. In the sections of the hull, we found some ballast stones. We did isotopic analysis, thin section, then we did the isotopic analysis. And a sample of these ballast stones actually matched the geomorphology of an area in India called the Deccan Traps. And if you remember, he said it was built at Surat, and this area is a volcanic region, and on the north and south side of Surat are two rivers, and this is where you would typically acquire stones to ballast your ship. Further field seasons, we found even more ship hull, and we found more clues. Here you can actually see what Kidd would have described as a rabbeted scarf, a rabbeted seam. We will also call it a scarf joint, but basically it's a tongue and groove hull construction technique that creates a more watertight seal between the planks. And Indian vessels were very well known for the longevity of their life and their usage. So we'll blast through some of this. How do we connect this all to the larger global context of the time? Right? It's not just the shipwreck, but it's the activity. So we have world systems, and we have connections of social networks, not social media, not Facebook or Instagram. But Kidd ran afoul of the English East India Company. Formed in 1600, it was officially named the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading with the East Indies. It spent the majority of the 17th century establishing trade and reaping immense profits in commerce with silk, spices, fabrics, and goods from them. In 1685, the company's stock was trading at 500 pounds a share. Now, if you go to the Bank of London's inflation calculator online, that's approximately 79,000 pounds per share. How did they do it so quickly? They tapped into Armenian merchant networks. The English had the ships, the Armenians had the networks, and that's how they were able to grow so fast. Unbeknownst to Kidd, when he captured the Quai Merchant, this is the French Pass, the captain was English, and a lot of the goods were connected to the English East India Company. And they had been having serious issues with piracy that was causing major hiccups in their trade, because a lot of privateers and pirates were getting commissions from the American colonies and engaging in what they called the Red Sea trade in the 1690s. For example, this individual here, Thomas II on the left, was actually named in Kidd's privateering commission. In 1693, he actually captured a ship in the Red Sea that was worth around 150,000 pounds. And then this gentleman, Henry Avery, captured a ship that was one of the Royal Mughal fleet, and was estimated to be anywhere from 250 to 600,000 pounds in value. So it was this climate of political intrigue, issues with economics, the power of the English East India Company, into which Kidd sailed in 1695. So, which ultimately led to the creation of the shipwreck, Quai Merchant, and Kidd's demise. So I'll get through this really quickly, because to come full circle, there's an applied aspect to this. And we look at shipwrecks as common pool resources. I was fortunate enough to have a class as a young grad student from Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom, who really focus on kind of community level, ground-based development of marine protected areas, and looking at how common pool resources can be adequately utilized. And shipwrecks, if you disturb it, if you take something off of it, that's gone, right? You can't make it back up, right? So we look at systems of marine protected areas and all the different facets that go into developing these things so that we can preserve it for scientific research and for the enjoyment of future generations. That also includes more applied aspects, such as how do you set up boundaries, how are you going to protect it, and in particular, with the site of the Quai Merchant, we actually used that shipwreck as the impetus to create a federally recognized community-managed marine protected area, and they still take snorkelers and divers out for tours to see a real pirate ship. And we worked with a number of different institutions to make this happen, and even including educational and outreach stuff. So because this site was not as sensitive, we were able to open that to the public. And in the case of the Encarnacion in Panama, that site has been reburied, but the artifacts that were sampled are on display at the museum at the Old Panama Trust, or Patronato Panama Viejo. And sometimes it gets even more interesting when you have museum exhibits such as the National Geographic Treasures of the Earth, and it's sort of deja vu when your son is on replica cannons from the site, and you look up and there's a mannequin of you. And also, this is one of the things, and also why I enjoy giving these types of presentations, because if we're not collectively learning from what we do as a scientist, in my case, archaeology, then what are we doing? What's the reason, right? And so both of these projects have been widely featured in the media, and even happen to have some more comical aspects, such as taking Guillermo from Jimmy Kimmel Live diving in a custom pirate wetsuit. And I know I've blasted through a lot pretty quickly tonight, but again, it's science. If you don't write it, it didn't happen. So if you are interested, there is a book on the entirety of the story of Captain Kidd's ship. There's a chapter on Henry Morgan in Pieces of Eight, and there's a larger kind of landscape co-authored book on the maritime landscape of Panama. And these were both recently featured in Drain the Oceans on the Nat Geo channel. I've got a lot of other things I could talk about. We've got a really awesome, phenomenal underwater archaeology program. And we're very lucky to be where we are. I'm going to blast through this and put a pin in some of the other things we're doing. And maybe we'll come back in a year or so and tell you some more stories, regale you with more things of the tools we're developing, aerial mags, handheld magnetometers for refining underwater survey, photo arrays with diver propulsion vehicles, and forensic underwater archaeology with the Department of Defense, POW, MIA accounting agency. We've got a lot of really cool things going on. So I think my eyes are bigger than my stomach, but I'll close by saying that this is what makes archaeology cool, is we connect with the past. And this is from one of the deep water wrecks that we studied in the Gulf of Mexico. From the spoon that someone used to potentially eat their last meal, to the bottle of ginger that the ship's medical officer probably supplied to the sailors when the seas turned, to the ship's log where the first mate was noting the worsening conditions, and to the sole of the shoe that speaks to the finality of a shipwreck event and the individuals that went down with it. And that's what makes archaeology special, and that's why I believe it is important and an integral part in marine sciences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fritz, for coming tonight and doing this. That was a great talk. And look at this wonderful crowd. We're so excited to see everyone here. Thank you all for sticking around till the very end. I know you want to jump to it and start asking some questions. So before we do that, I just wanted to say we are going to have another lecture that's happening on February 21st. It's David Kaplan, and it is going to be on meat and fish foods of the future via cellular agriculture. We'll have these things up on the slide later on. And we're getting ourselves set. What we're going to do is take some questions here from the audience. If you'll just raise your hand, we'll have our young ladies come around with a microphone. After you have asked your question, please hand the microphone back to our helpers here. We appreciate it.
Have you ever done any research off of the wrecks off of Key Biscayne and the Florida Keys on the reefs?
Yes, actually, that's my microphone. That's actually one of the things that we do that is pretty neat. We work with Biscayne National Park, and we help them with their annual site monitoring. And so the students get trained on how to take the measurements and map the sites and do orthomosaics and use the cameras and the software. And then that goes into the National Park's annual site monitoring report. So yeah, we get out there and we dive a lot.
Has the number ever been documented?
Geneva might know better than me, but I believe it's in the 80s. 88 is where it stands right now. And there are, for those that are divers and snorkelers, there are 7 wrecks that are publicly available on the Maritime Heritage Trail. So you can go check those out. And that gets into that kind of the applied aspect of what I was talking about with using marine protected areas to actually have people interact with the cultural heritage.
Whatever happened to the buried treasure?
Oh, good question. So, and this is where, that's a very good question. I encourage you to look at the books because I've glossed over a lot of historical information. After they arrested Kidd, they went and rounded everything up. The governor went and he turned it in. And so that's the treasure that I mentioned, that when Kidd was arrested and sent to London, they sent everything that they could get over with him, and it was basically impounded. But that's what they used to, a good chunk of that is what they used to build the Greenwich Hospital.
Why is Caesar's Creek in South Biscayne Bay called Caesar's Creek?
Oh man, here we go. I don't know. I feel like that's maybe 3 words scientists should say more often. I could try to find out. There are numerous accounts of why it's called Caesar's Creek, and one of them, the most famous, has to do with a pirate. But I have not found anything in the historical record that looks at that, neither has the Park Service archaeologists. Yes?
I read once that there was supposedly Spanish galleons sunk off Miami and never read any more on it. Is there any truth to this, or is this a myth?
I have not yet seen anything about that. What I do know is the northernmost ship of the 1733 fleet is actually Nuestra Señora de Popolo, and that's located within Biscayne National Park. And then there's a big gap until you get up to Jupiter, where you have the losses, the shipwrecks from the 1715 fleet that sank during a storm as well. I don't know of anything off of Miami. But that's one of the things with maritime archaeology is there's always, again, it's like sorting the fact from the fiction, like what's urban legend and what's a sea story versus what's the actual history and what does the archaeological record tell you. But if there is one, that'd be pretty cool. I haven't come across any of that in anything that I've read or looked at.
Has there ever been treasure buried on the sands of a beach in Miami?
Well, the PG answer, it depends on what you would define as treasure. So, historically speaking, I don't know. For example, Padre Island National Seashore, they had some Spanish wrecks in 1554, and they will find coins eroding out of the sand there. I don't know of any Spanish shipwrecks or artifacts or material culture. I like to use material culture instead of the term treasure, that have been found in the sands off Miami, but I'm sure there's a lot of things that have been found in the sands off Miami. I guess in the back.
Hi, good evening. A question for you. I actually have 3. One, since I have the microphone.
It's like cheating, isn't it?
Where in the world would you find the most lucrative findings or the most lucrative shipwrecks? That's one. 2, who owns the rights to that? Is it the scientists or the researchers that go dive for it? And then the other question is, where would you find information on slave ships that were sunken?
Those are 3 good questions. I think the answer to which ships are most lucrative depends on who's placing the value on them, right? So as archaeologists, we don't believe in treasure hunting. We don't believe in selling the artifacts for commercial good. We believe that it's something we all can learn from. Now, that's not to say that you can't make a profit from a traveling museum exhibit and keep the collection intact so that it can still be studied later on. But, somebody who is of Danish heritage might think Viking ships are more important than Spanish colonial ships, and somebody might think that finding a slave shipwreck might be more important than looking at something from World War II. So a lot of it is contextual as to what you would define as lucrative. To answer your second question, Remind me, what was your second question? Rights. Oh, that also depends. Typically, when we're doing archaeology as it's a science, we're permitted by the country in which we're operating, right? For example, if we're doing work down in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, if we're in 3 miles from the Keys, we need a state permit from the Division of Historical Resources, but we also need a federal permit from NOAA and Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. In foreign countries, it depends on how they do it. And usually, within archaeology, again, it gets back to that, public good. The artifacts and the sites and the collections all stay within that country, and usually they're used for education and outreach and museum exhibits and those kinds of purposes. The Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary also has an extensive shipwreck trail for people to enjoy and experience shipwrecks as well. All right. Number 3. I was good with the first one, I'm sorry.
Number 3 was about slave ships.
That's another thing where you would look at, and Geneva's been involved with a number of projects, including South Africa. There's a consortium of archaeologists that are collaborating on this, and with the Society of Black Archaeologists as well. You would look at who were the slavers, right? And so there have been a couple of wrecks that have been looked at off the coast of Africa that were Portuguese. So then you want to look in the archives in Portugal. And again, same with Spain. It all depends on kind of who was doing the slaving and how good their record keeping was to be able to use the historical documents to try and pinpoint some of these sites. And that's another thing, I'll just put another plug for archaeology, but that's something that archaeology does that's different from history, because we can ask ourselves who writes history, right? It's the winners. And so what about the people that don't have a voice in the historical record? And what about the people that have been lost to time because they weren't documented? Well, we can find information and learn more about those people through archaeology and through excavating and interpreting and analyzing these different sites, and give voice to those that didn't in the past.
I have a question. We have
Yes.
one question from somebody who was online. And what was the reason Captain Kidd was hung for the second time?
Okay, so he basically became sort of the scapegoat for piracy. The English East India Company they had, for example, all right, I'm trying to give you the abridged version because I gave the very abridged version already. For example, the Mughal Empire laid siege to one of their factories for almost a year until they surrendered. So the English East India Company was incredibly independent and powerful. They had their own standing armies. They were allowed to make agreements with foreign governments. And so any kind of act of piracy had started to become popularly attributed to English pirates. And part of the cargo in the Quetta Merchant, about 40% of that belonged to a noble in the Mughals' court, and the other 60% belonged to the Armenian Merchant Consortium. And so with Thomas II and Henry Avery, and I named 2 of them because they're kind of the biggest catches or captures. The Red Sea piracy was a problem, and the English East India Company was losing money and having to spend money to try and quell this issue. And sort of the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back was Captain Kidd when he captured the Quetta Merchant. And then that became an issue where the English East India Company is going back to the British Crown saying, we've got to put a stop to this. Well, the king, his signature was on Kidd's privateering commission, and he had several Whig lords that had financially backed him, but the politics had changed in the 4 and change that Kidd was voyaging around the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, and the Tories had come into power, and they were using the king's support of Kidd and Kidd's theft of the Indian nobleman's cargo and the Armenian merchant's cargo. It became kind of the political hot button of the day. And it's I guess you can almost look like kind of like Oliver North and the Iran-Contra scandal, right? Where they needed a scapegoat. The king was trying to save his own rear end. And so they're like, well, we said privateering. He went out and stole. He went off and did his own thing. That's not what we were agreeing to. And they sort of washed their hands of him. And so when the rope breaks, they're like, no, we can't let him go. Get him back up on the scaffolding.
Thank you so much. I think that's all we have for this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.